Even when he wanted something done, he often didn't force. He would say, would you like to do this? Or this would be better. So he never forced women to marry. On occasion, he did ask some women to marry because he thought that would be best. And the marriages didn't work out, and then he stopped. And then all he did was bless marriages. When people would say, Prabhupada, can I get married? As in my case, I asked Prabhupada. He said, yes, you have my blessings. And then most of those marriages didn't work out. And then Prabhupada said that if you want to get married, that's something you can discuss locally with your president or GBC. I don't want to be involved. He didn't want to take responsibility in the sense that he's giving blessings and then these couples are divorcing. So he just said, no longer my position. But when he was asked by some of his leaders that we have women that don't want to get married, do they have to get married? He said, no, they don't. So that would appear to be contrary to the Varnashram, that a woman stays single her entire life. But it supports more the other side of the argument, which is let's see what works best for preaching, and what works best for preaching can be a criteria. Varnashram can be a criteria, what works best for preaching can be a criteria, and ideally, if we're smart, then the best criteria would be to balance what works for preaching and what works for Varnashram, right? But as younger devotees, we didn't think much about Varnashram because it wasn't an emphasis. We were just thinking about preaching. And Prabhupada addressed this issue in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and he said some people criticize us because we allow women to live in our temples and engage in preaching work. And then Prabhupada said, but they're as good as their brothers. And what did Prabhupada mean that they're good as their brothers? They were doing the same services that their brothers were doing. They were pujaris, they were cooks, they were book distributors, they were giving classes like that. So he said, they're as good as their brothers, meaning they can do the same work as their brothers. So he, as far as preaching, he didn't discriminate. But your question, I think, is more about, does a woman need a man to become whole or complete? And Prabhupada's answer to saying that you can remain brahmachari, and the answer to the protection, well, if you're living in a temple, there's protection. There's temple authorities, just as men are protected. What are we protected? We're fed, we're clothed, we're given a place to live, we're given counseling if we need it, so that kind of protection. And generally, when we talk of protection of women, the primary thing we talk about is protection from exploitation by men. And the paradox of your question is that a lot of times when women get married, their husbands are the ones who exploit them. The one who is supposed to protect them becomes the one that they need protection from. So that's the paradox of Kali Yuga. Do I need to be protected by a man, and then I marry a man, and I need to call the police to protect me from him? So that happens, right? I mean, it's not funny, but it's such a paradox. So, the main protection we're talking about is the women being protected from being exploited by men. So when that generally wouldn't happen in a temple, and if it did, the temple president, the temple leaders would step in and deal with it. So Prabhupada's saying they are protected living in a temple. And if you have a spiritual master, then you're also protected spiritually, right? So Prabhupada had no problem with that. Now, the argument on the other side is that we try to kind of minimize varnashram or compromise it in some way by some women being single and then later on putting on white as renounced women and then getting married, and men taking sannyas and not being able to maintain it and then getting married. So there's an argument that paradigm that Prabhupada was pushing doesn't work, or it's not safe, that we really should go for the varnashram because it's more normal. Get married, have children, and go through the system and then become renounced. You'll naturally become renounced when you're older. So in most cases, that's true. And therefore, Prabhupada at some point didn't want to give sannyas. And Prabhupada, he was a little bit aloof from encouraging people to get married or remain single. Although a few people he did encourage to take sannyas. But the general encouragement was, go, if you want to take sannyas, get married, and go through the process. So that, and we kind of understood that at some point, that was probably best for most people. But just in most temples, you won't find so much preaching that women should be single. You'll find more that when a woman wants to be single, that they'll be taught or spoken to that we think this is artificial, and you're repressing a natural instinct, or you really don't trust men, or you've been exploited by men, or you see that there are many bad marriages in the world, even in our movement, and you don't want to get married. So sometimes the guru will see through that and say, well, I really feel that you do want to get married, and these are all smoke screens. Then you need to see through the smoke and say that, well, your desire is to have a husband and a family, and that's natural, but you've just lost faith in that institution. So that's okay if you lost faith in the institution, but you have to have the renunciation. It can't just be frustration, because frustration doesn't maintain you throughout your life. If you might say, for example, no, I'd like to have a nice family, I'd like to be married, but I don't think there's any men, or they're so rare, or I don't trust them, or I don't want to be controlled by them, or I fear that they'll limit me, they'll make me feel like I'm inferior, so I'd rather not be married. Okay, that's a valid consideration. I'm not arguing with that, and I agree, there are many men who would make you feel that way, and if that were the case, if I were a woman, I would also have concerns about being married and being subjugated, when in fact I may be more qualified than the men who are subjugating me in the name of Krishna consciousness or devotional service, right? But then I would look at the other side. Do I actually want to be married? Do I lack the renunciation to be single? And therefore, am I saying I don't want to be married just because I'm frustrated with the way things are with men? Or I'm a liberated woman and I just don't want to be controlled by a man. Because behind that liberated woman usually is a frustration. And Prabhupada addresses this in his books. He says there are two kinds of sannyasis. One's frustrated and one's renounced. And the frustrated one is just, I don't want this anymore, and he leaves home. He's just fed up, can't deal with it. But he's not actually renounced, he's just frustrated. So it's not going to work unless you actively remain frustrated your whole life just to keep you on your path of renunciation, which is kind of stupid and unnatural. And there's no guarantee 10 years from now you'll be frustrated. And we have seen that many frustrated men had left their wives and become sannyasis. And then got married later. Or men got married, divorced their wives out of frustration. They didn't take sannyas, and they got married again. So they thought they were renounced, but actually they were just frustrated. They weren't renounced. And after the frustration wore out, then their desire to have a woman and a family came back. They just weren't happy with that woman and family. So they took it as, well, I guess I'm renounced. I'm not attracted to this woman. That means I'm renounced, right? This woman is yelling at me 10 times a day. Yeah, obviously I'm not attracted to her. Obviously she's made me very renounced, right? I'm ready to run out of this house and never come back. But it doesn't mean I'm renounced. It just means I'm kind of disgusted and frustrated. Of course, it might be your fault that she's yelling at you. That's another issue. But you understand what I'm saying. So when you're contemplating, do I really, as a woman, do I really need a husband? Should I really be married? And if you don't feel like it, then you have to ask yourself the question, am I just frustrated? Or is it because I don't see any good men? And or I'm afraid because there's so many bad men and so many of my friends had bad marriages. I'm just afraid to be married. Okay, so that's valid, but it doesn't mean you're renounced. And it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you're afraid that something bad might happen, that 10 years from now you won't be going crazy thinking, oh, I should have been married and had kids. Because sometimes the need for children, because it's biological, kicks in at a certain age. And then you'll regret that you weren't married. Yes? Yeah, you're like 36 and you don't have kids because you think men are jerks, and then you just want to have children desperately. And you're like, oh my God, what do I do now? And the older you get, the less unmarried men there are. Or if you're too old, most likely you're going to marry a man who has kids. It'll be a second time. So these are things to consider. So it's about being real. But part of your question is also, I think part of the question is also, can women be successful, highly functional, and lead the preaching of Krishna consciousness without being married, without being in the shadow of a man, protected by a man, and so forth? And the answer is yes, of course. Now, whether that is being preached everywhere in the world or whether that's manifested in the culture everywhere in the world is another question. But at least on paper, or at least for the record, when we organized our movement and organized our preaching, there were very few things that men did that women didn't do. One of the obvious ones was there was a lack. Most everything was managed by men. But I think that was also reflecting the current culture at the time. And also just the idea that men would have a hard time taking orders from women. Now, imagine you're a temple president, right? You're 35 years old and you have to tell 60-year-old men that you're in trouble because you didn't come to Mangalartik and we're going to kick you out of the temple if you don't start getting up for Mangalartik. That's going to be a little difficult for the men to hear. And the men just might say, I don't want a woman temple president. I don't want a woman telling me what to do. So that's partially the reason. Now, in our movement, we have women in their 60s who are temple presidents. And it works quite well. Because a 60-year-old man can listen to a 60-year-old woman, and a 20-year-old man can listen to a 60-year-old woman. Everybody can kind of listen, because the 60-year-old men, their ego has kind of been deflated by age. It's just a natural process. And the 20-year-old men, that 60-year-old woman is their mother or grandmother. So it's, So there's another, rather than assuming that Prabhupada didn't want women in management positions, which I know many people say, especially the advocates of Varnashram, because it's just not, they don't feel it's the right place for a woman. But the advocates of the preaching movement have pointed out that the argument that Prabhupada didn't put women in positions of authority, they say, proves he didn't want them to manage. But when you actually find out why he didn't, it's for the reason I said, it was because the men wouldn't accept it. Not because Prabhupada didn't want to do it. Now, the advocates of Varnashram might say, well, that proves our point. And it is a good point that generally men don't accept it. But in cases where they do, in cases where there's no one else to manage the temple or they can do a better job, I think it would be hard-pressed to prove that Prabhupada wouldn't approve it. And they cite the example, well, he wanted Jamuna to be GBC, and then he decided against it because she was a woman. But Prabhupada's servant who was there and who was privy to this discussion said it's not because he thought she's a woman and not qualified, not intelligent, this or that. It's because the men wouldn't accept it. That was the reason Prabhupada gave. He said, I would appoint her, she's qualified, but the men won't accept it. So that's why he didn't do it. And that was interpreted or assumed by many people that he didn't want women in management positions. But When I was a young devotee, women were giving classes, women were leading kirtans, they were doing everything. It just evolved differently over time. So, can women exist and be fired up and productive without being married? Yes. Do they have to be married? No. One of the problems we face in ISKCON is when women are made to believe that they can't be functional unless they're in the shadow of a man. Now, many women naturally want to be married and serve their husbands, and it makes them happy. And we're not saying there's something wrong with them. All we're saying is that sometimes you have women who are very qualified, who were raised in social circumstances where they were doing everything the men were doing, and when they become devotees, they want to continue doing that. Not to compete with the men, outdo the men, not to become women, start an ISKCON women's liberation movement, which it seems like they do, but they're just actually continuing in the roles that they grew up with, where they were basically doing the same thing men were doing. So in Prabhupada's books, he addresses this point, and he said, I'm criticized for engaging the women, for allowing them to live in temples. But in the West, the culture is different than in India. So I'm adjusting to the culture. So I think this would be an example of Prabhupada adjusting to the culture. That women come and they want to do what the men do. So there was I've told this story before, but Prabhupada came to New York and he said, I want all of you to open temples. This was, I don't know, maybe 1968 or something. 68, 69 is the latest. He said, I want all of you to open temples. And then one of the ladies said, Prabhupada, and the women also? And Prabhupada said, yes. So that's how Prabhupada was thinking. He was looking at our culture, and he was seeing what women do in the West that they didn't do in India. And then, when Prabhupada came here, women didn't drive cars in India. It was 1965. Women didn't. There's a lot of things women didn't do, which we as Westerners find it kind of strange, because at the age of 16 we learn how to drive, man or women. So Prabhupada was observing things like this, which just were different. Women driving cars, and women leading and organizing, and so he had women who would organize things. Sometimes they would be better organizers than men. So he was just observing this, and the practical person he would engage them. And for him, it was just the way this culture is, so why go against it? That's just how it is. The women do a lot of what the men do. Okay, so let them do it. The men don't seem to mind. We didn't mind. As young devotees, we didn't mind. That was just normal. We didn't really discriminate. If a woman was intelligent, if a woman was knowledgeable, then we would listen to her. We didn't think, well, you can't listen to her because she's a woman. We started thinking that later. We got brainwashed into thinking that. And it was an interpretation of our philosophy to make us think that women are just less qualified in all areas. And the wonderful thing about Krishna is he creates different kinds of people. And amongst men and women, there are different kinds of people because we need different things done. Everybody can't just be a philosopher. We need practical people. We need accountants. But we also need creative people. Otherwise, nothing changes. Everything is dull and boring. And we need people who know how to lay bricks, and we need people who know how to engineer skyscrapers and create rocket ships and airplanes. And you need people who know how to maintain them and fly them. You need all these different kinds of people. So you look at the nature of male and female, you need those natures. They're so different, but you need them to create balance in the world. Otherwise, if everything is female or everything is male, the world will be weird, won't it? If it was all just male or all just female, it would be weird. So there have been arguments made that ISKCON is very male-dominated because women don't have a lot of say. They don't have a lot of input. And I've been places and I've gone to temples and I've met their temple councils. And I saw that it was all male, and in some places all Indian. Not one white person, not one woman. And I can say, I understand a lot about your temple right now, by looking at your council. I know exactly what you think of women and how you deal with them. Because if you had a different culture, you would have women. You would have young people on the council. You say, in this council, everybody is 35 and older, male and Indian. What does that say about your thinking? Older male Indians are the people we want to run the project. So it's interesting. So then if a woman joins that temple, even if the men don't say it, subconsciously she'll understand that it must be in the Vedas that something's lacking in women because there's no women organizing anything here. Even though I'm the CEO of a big company, when I come to ISKCON, I think, yeah, well, maybe there's something lacking. So that's a problem because women have been made to feel that way. And they're qualified and made to feel unqualified. More often not by the culture as much as verbally, just being told. And then they can start to doubt themselves, which is unfortunate, right? So then this devotee's asking this question, well, then I kind of am anti-men. I don't want to be around them because they just make me feel bad, like there's something wrong with me, you know, or I can't do what I have to do. So and then seeing all the bad marriages, then the woman thinks, okay, you know, it's better I don't be married. Better I don't, you know, do I have to work under a man? Do I have to be guided by a man? No, but the temple has structure. So if it's a male temple president, yeah. If it's a female temple president, then you don't have to be guided by a man. If it's male, yeah. But it's not that you can't do all the services that men do. That's the question she's asking, because it's kind of made, sometimes you're made to feel in ISKCON, and maybe as a woman, you're not capable enough unless you work under a man or under the protection of a man or the guidance, or you're not allowed to do everything a man does because the men are doing everything, basically, right? Well, yesterday we had kirtan, right? One woman and the rest men, right? That's ISKCON. You know, if you just do a statistical analysis of what men do and what women do in ISKCON in terms of more prominent roles, it's like 95% men, right? Does that mean the men are more qualified than the women to do those roles? I don't think so. I think it's just, that's the structure of it. So she's asking the question, is it, if you see 95% of the roles male, can I do it also? Or must I act, or as a woman, is it socially improper? And as a woman, am I not qualified? Because that's the message you get from, right? I mean, we don't intend to send that message, but we don't intend to send the message, but the fact is we have that message within us, even if we don't know it, because it's manifest in the structure. And if you didn't have the message within you, you'd have more women on your council giving classes, leading kirtans, right? You would, but that means you think that way also. It's just you don't think it out loud. It's just unstated. So then it creates doubts for women, so that's why she's asking the question. And the obvious answer, which everybody knows, is who's qualified to do what is who's qualified to do what. It's not arbitrary that a man or a woman is qualified. It's who do you have in your group? Let's find out who's qualified. Now, a woman may be qualified, but not good in relationships. So we'll say, well, she's not qualified. And a lesser qualified man who's better in relationships, we might say he's more qualified because he's better with people. Or we might say he's more qualified because if you do it, nobody's going to listen to you even though you're more qualified, because that's the culture we have right now. So sometimes it's like that, and we just have to deal with it. We go, okay, you're more qualified than your husband, but the men aren't going to listen to you. So he's got to do it. And you're behind him, and so you consult together, and a lot of temples run that way. We're actually, some people say we don't want female temple presidents, right? But in so many cases, the women were running the temples. It's just the man was a temple president, but he wasn't into it, and his wife was behind the scenes running, but you couldn't put her as the figurehead, because the culture was there that people wouldn't accept it. So, to say we don't want women temple presidents or they can't do it, It's not entirely accurate because many temples were actually run behind the scenes by women. And the women will definitely tell you that. So, and what answer to this question is just, it's going to depend on the temple you're in terms of, if you ask this question that you're asking me to the temple president, it will depend on the culture of the temple, the philosophy of the temple. If you ask this question in India, you're going to get a different answer than if you ask this question in New York City. Because India is more conservative in this regard. New York is more liberal in this regard. Right? And so, we're having this issue. It's a very interesting issue. I don't know if you follow it, but the GBC has been discussing the issue of female Diksha gurus. And so the first question was, they just wanted to make sure, according to Shastra, that you could do this. So they have a Shastra Advisory Council, which is comprised of learned devotees, and they look through Vaishnava history and philosophy to answer questions that the GBC gives them, and this was one question they asked: can women be gurus? So they did the research, they looked at all the arguments pro and con. So it wasn't like they just did research blindly, but they looked at all the arguments against it and for it, and tried to validate the arguments against and the arguments for. And they came up with some arguments against and some arguments for. And they felt that the arguments against were not strong, and there were many strong and more arguments for. So they presented their paper that, according to our philosophy, women can be gurus. And so you would think that would be the end of it, right? Then the GBC, well, it was the end of it, and the GBC passed a resolution that women could be gurus, but there was a body who wanted to further discuss it and table it and say, can you put this on hold? We need to discuss it, because we don't believe women can be gurus. So then it was no longer, I don't believe it was really a philosophical discussion as much as a social discussion. Should we allow females in the role of guru? Because it doesn't fit in with Varnashram, that women shouldn't be leading. So it came back to this Varnashram versus preaching. It seems like there's two polar opposites. There's a certain philosophy for preaching, there's a certain philosophy for establishing Varnashram. And that's really the discussion here. What can you do? How far can you go in the name of preaching? Where do you stop? Does anything go in the name of preaching? And certainly you have to have parameters. You have to have borders for sure. But as far as roles of male and female, Prabhupada didn't really create those. And you'd really be hard pressed to prove that he did. Now, do male and female have different roles? They do. Especially in a marriage. But in terms of opportunities for service, we don't really see Prabhupada restricting them. The most important, some of the most, foundational services were book distribution and deity worship. So men and women did both. And, the biggest restriction we saw was in management. Women managing men. And as I said before, men didn't want to be managed by women. So that was one of the reasons. Now, Aladdin was asking, what does it mean how does humility apply in relation to male-female? Well, male psychology is they like to dominate. And male psychology is they don't really appreciate women telling them. Well, we don't appreciate anybody telling us, but we less appreciate women telling us. So, the humility in male-female relationship is that women need to understand that men, and Prabhupada says this in his books, they like to be honored. So when a woman says, how could you do that? You're so stupid. It just destroys him, because the male ego thrives on honor. That's food, isn't it? The male ego's food is honor and appreciation. And men they subconsciously know this. So generally men are very respectful towards one another. Even when they're disrespectful, it's in a way, it's still respectful. It's joking. Hey, like that you might joke, look at you, it looks like you just got out of the, whatever, Looks like you just got out of bed, But there's always an air of respect. Male ego requires respect, for sure. So the humility of a woman in dealing with a man is that he requires a lot of respect. And then the women might say, well, what about me? Don't I require respect? Women require affection more. Everyone requires respect. And men require affection also. But the balance of what the men need in terms of affection and respect is like this, and for women it's affection and respect. Affection's, respect is included in affection. If you're affectionate to a woman, then they need to be acknowledged and respected. It's included more in that. She just feels good. But men could be loved, but not respected, and they need the respect. It's more important. Your wife is is affectionate. She serves you nicely, but if you don't once in a while hear like you're the man, you're great. The affection is okay, but the respect that's really the male ego needs that. So one big mistake women make is if they put down men, the men just they can't deal with it. They just turn off, because their ego needs that respect so much. So they have to be careful in how they deal with it. And men do a lot of things that are wrong, and it makes it hard for women to tell them, because men don't want to hear. And in a very male-dominated society, in a very male-dominated ISKCON, something very bad happened. And it's interesting. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but years ago, some women got together and they said, we need to form a women's ministry. It's called the ISKCON Vaishnavi Ministry, or ISKCON Vaishnavi. And it was kind of like a civil rights movement for women. I mean, not overtly, but that's when you analyze it, that's really what it is. And if you go to their page and you read their articles, you'll read things about how the injustices perpetrated against women in ISKCON, although they might be minor, they're more attitudes than actions, but the attitudes come out subtly in restrictions, or like I say, there's a temple board and half the temple is women, or half your congregation is women, and there's no women representing them, and there's 8 men, and things like that. So it's not like we're abusing them verbally or mistreating them, but it's subtle, right? So I was thinking about the women's ministry, and these women were asking me, would you talk about women? So I thought, okay, that's fine, we can talk about it. And I thought, well, let me just see what's up on the women's ministry. So I read some articles, and mostly they're about women's position in ISKCON, how they personally deal with it, how Prabhupada dealt with them, and the male-female imbalances that they observe, and how it's negatively affecting our society. So I'm looking at the page, and I kind of saw it like a civil rights movement within ISKCON for women. And then the obvious came up to me, is that this ministry, number one, we shouldn't have had a need for it. We had a need because of discrimination against women. That's number one. And number two, even worse, it shouldn't have had to have been the women that came up with it. It should have been the men who came up with it, who said, hey, there's not equality here. Women are being discriminated. They're not allowed to give class, but they're allowed to make flower garlands. That's about it. And it sends a message. Well, that's about what we think you're qualified to do. That's like your level. You can make the garlands, but no, you're not going to give class. So men should have saw that and said, okay, this is the wrong message. We're inviting new people to come in, and they want to take part, and the women are only allowed to do sew this and string this, and that's about it, even though you're the head of, a big bank in London. But when you come to ISKCON, you can string garlands, and you could cook also, you could wash, clean the room, but you can't do what the men are doing. So it seems to me that the failing on the men is they should have saw this, and they should have been the ones who started the ministry. But the women had to start it because they have to point out to the men that we're our rights, or we're not being treated as fairly as men, or we're just being treated unfairly in many cases in many temples. Now, every temple is different. So I'm just speaking generally. Some temples are fantastic. There's no difference. But that kind of hit me straight in the head, that wait a minute, the women had to fend for themselves, and men are supposed to protect women. So that, I think, it was a huge failing, right? The men should have saw that the women are not being given the same rights for service and other aspects of their lives, and we should do something about it. We should have formed the ministry. We should have got women together and talked to them to form it. I mean, maybe it happened that way, but to my knowledge, it didn't. It was women who got together who had to ask the GBC, can we have this ministry? Whereas it should have been, ideally, the GBC who got those women together and asked them, could you have this ministry to guide us to better serve the needs of women? So, now, how do you deal with that as a woman in ISKCON? I think you need to understand it, number one. And number two, any kind of derogatory statements against women, you shouldn't buy into it. You should understand that those are male issues. They're not your issues. They're male issues. There's male. I mean, that's a strong statement, and that would end up criticizing a lot of men. But I just think it's true. I don't think from Prabhupada's perspective these are actually issues. And many people have brought up issues which I've never seen Prabhupada bring up, female issues. By taking some statement of Manu Samhita or Chanaka Pandit that Prabhupada may have quoted, never did Prabhupada enact those statements in any way, live his life according to those statements, but then they expand on them. It says right here, and Prabhupada quoted him. But their statements, what should you beat? A horse and a wife. Okay, so we should institute wife beating because there's a statement there in Shastra somewhere, or some Niti Shastra, and Prabhupada quoted it. Now, that kind of thing. That we've seen happen. So, yeah. So at least when you look at the culture, if you understand it, and it's got a history because we've come from a male-dominated culture, and ISKCON was part of a male-dominated culture, and then we give all the prominent positions to men, and they set the standards, and there's not a lot of female input, so it's very male-oriented. And some men are immature in their understanding, and they make women believe that they're trouble, they're problems, we don't want you around. You end up marrying our brahmacharis and ruining their lives, etc., etc. And you're not that smart anyway. And then you buy into that, it can destroy you, or at least can harm you to some degree, because then you'll feel disempowered, right? So, that's just the message, is don't buy into it if it doesn't resonate with you. Because what it'll do is it'll make you feel bad about how you feel. So, well, I never really felt I was disqualified, and then I go, well, maybe I'm puffed up, thinking that I'm qualified. But that kind of philosophy then messes people up, because it's not true, Anyone who says anything to make you feel there's something wrong with you, there's actually something wrong with them. Prabhupada never said anything to make us feel like there was something wrong with us. He might have said something to make us realize we did something wrong, but he didn't say things to make us feel like there's something wrong with us, and certainly he never made the women feel like there was anything wrong with them. So they asked Prabhupada, well, can women give class? He said, yeah, if they're qualified. It's like such a common sense answer. It's like, why do you have to ask that? Well, we have to ask those things. I mean, are women subhumans? Can they actually sit on the asana? Or is that like sacrilegious? Even though Prabhupada had Jamuna preaching to thousands, tens of thousands of Indians, we have to ask, is it okay? They're like, where's that coming from? It's not coming from Prabhupada. And then construing a philosophy that it's not okay because women shouldn't be in prominent roles. I understand that, and I understand how it's supported in Scripture, but I don't see it supported by Prabhupada's example. So that's the problem I have. If someone supports something in Scripture, that's one thing. But if it's not supported by what Prabhupada himself did, it's really hard for me, personally, to accept it. And in a movement that's meant to spiritualize the world, it's not hard for me to understand that we teach differences between men and women, and we teach various roles, particularly in the Grihastha ashram. But in terms of the preaching movement, it seemed like Prabhupada pretty much equaled it out. You look at his books, he talks about how a wife should act. He gives the duties of a wife and he gives the duties of a husband, and they're different. And he talks about the male ego and how the wife should serve and be nice and speak nicely and be tolerant, because that works for the man. And then the man becomes nice because the wife is nice. So it's like the weapon of the wife is to be submissive, and then the husband becomes submissive. So he talked about that. So there's definitely different gender roles and different psychology, and he talked about it. But in terms of preaching, he never said, well, because women are like this, they can't distribute books. He never said that. What I find very interesting is if you look at traditional roles of women protected, you wouldn't send women out on the street talking to men, would you? And that's what we did. And Prabhupada encouraged them to distribute books. And he knew they were talking to men all day. He wasn't in illusion that they weren't doing that. He was clear that's what they were doing. He knew that. So from the point of view of chaste woman, what chaste woman goes out on the street and just walks up to men and starts talking to them? That externally would be an example of an unchaste woman. And are we saying that Prabhupada's asking women to be unchaste by engaging them in sankirtan? Of course not. He's engaging them in the highest welfare work. So, with that example there, then arguing they should just stay at home and not go out. All right, for society in general, maybe, but we have a movement, a mission, and that transcends those considerations. So my point is, he gave them the same service that the men had, and even it may not be proper according to Vedic society that they go out and do that, but it kind of preaching transcended those limitations. So we have to consider that, and if we put those limitations on, then we have to ask ourselves, does that reflect Prabhupada's mood, who didn't seem to put those limitations on them? The only one he seemed to put on was management, and as we said, it's just because men wouldn't do well with women managing them, which has changed now because they're older. So I don't know if that answered your question about, do women have to be in the shadow of men to be successful? It doesn't seem that Prabhupada thought that if they want to remain single. But when they're married, thing is, sometimes we generalize, and that's okay. But specific situations don't fit in with generalization. So sometimes the women were more Krishna conscious than their husbands, or they'd actually be the gurus. They'd wear the dhoti in the family, so to speak, because they were just more Krishna conscious. And if the husband understood that, he would take advice. He would say, okay. He would respect that. If he was humble, he would respect it. Now, where in Prabhupada's books or where in Shastras is going to say the husband should take instruction from the wife? Everywhere it's going to say the husband's the guru and the wife should follow. But in one case, the husband realized that his wife, he wasn't that strong, and his wife was very fixed. So he wrote Prabhupada and said, she's more Krishna conscious than I am, and I'm supposed to be the guru, so how do we work this out? He said, Prabhupada said, just follow her. So for Prabhupada, it wasn't a problem. But for many people, it's like, no, you can't do that. That's against Vedic, it's not right. But Prabhupada's mood was, you just do what works. If it helps you become Krishna conscious and it helps the preaching, then that's what you do. It was like, for Prabhupada, it wasn't a big issue. So I think at least we have to realize that sometimes we might make issues big that aren't big because we think we're transgressing culture or whatever. Of course, in some cases, we might be. But in many cases, we're not, and we're making issues out of non-issues. We're making issues out of things Prabhupada didn't make issues of. So if we're going to make an issue out of something, I think we should make sure Prabhupada made an issue out of it. Because if he didn't, and we do, that's not right. Generally. I don't think. How could you make an issue out of something that Prabhupada didn't have an issue with? And just say, well, he didn't have an issue with it because that was 1965. That's not a strong argument. How can you prove that? It wasn't an issue for him then and it would be now. It's the same issue now as then. Nothing's changed. Just people have smartphones and computers and they didn't have it then. But what else really changed fundamentally? Human nature is the same. So, at least, that's my understanding. So why don't we take some questions now? Alana's asking about the humility of a woman. Humility for a man. Everybody should be humble. Humility is, it's an outstanding quality. We should all have it. So, humility means respect, basically. If you're humble, you respect others. Right? And like we were talking last night, you respect them in general, but you respect how they feel. So you don't do anything to make them feel bad. That's part of respect. Okay, why don't you ask some questions? Because I think we've covered the topic, haven't we? It takes them 20 seconds before they hear what I say. So as I say, you have any questions, then it takes them 20 seconds to hear that then 20 seconds to start thinking about, the brain to kick in to think, and then another 40 seconds to formulate it. So sometimes we don't get questions for a minute and a half. You have a question?
Yes. If you could just give a few pointers on how to serve the wife better. Sorry,
yeah, how to serve the... Well, like we were saying last night, the general premise is what will enhance the relationship as opposed to do anything which would harm it or just make the other person withdraw and not want to engage. So that's the basic premise. If you want to know, it really requires understanding the psychology of your spouse. Because if you understand the psychology of your spouse, you understand their needs. Because your needs and her needs are different. So if she treats you according, in the way that she wants to be treated, that doesn't necessarily work. And you treat her in a way you want to be treated, it doesn't necessarily work because what you want may not be what she needs. So I've always found it's important to understand the different psychology of male and female, because then you can give her what she needs even though you don't need it. She needs a house like this, you don't care what the house is like. She needs this like this, you don't care. And you're trying to figure out why she would care, but if you try to figure it out from a male perspective, you won't figure it out because it won't make sense to you necessarily. But if you understand, well, women are like this and they have these needs, their nature is different, then it'll make sense. Not that it's going to change the way you feel personally, but it'll help you understand why she needs it. And if you want to relate better to someone, you have to understand what they're like. So I think that's a really big one. That's where we mess up. because you would naturally think maybe to do something, because you yourself wouldn't need it. So you assume she wouldn't. You know, it's like if your wife went out and bought you earrings, you'd go, oh, that's nice. But if you bought her earrings, she would like it like 10 times more than you would, because that's... Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you can try and experiment. Buy him some earrings.
I have.
Yeah.
Not these ones.
Yeah. And he's like, wow, thank you. But you appreciate it more, because women appreciate gifts more, right? And men are practical. So sometimes he gives you like, why'd you buy that? I don't need that. And a woman is like, thank you, even if she doesn't need it. You go, that's a kind thought. Thank you for thinking of me. It's not exactly my favorite color, but, you know, and she'll wear it to keep you happy. So the women will appreciate the gesture more, and the man will appreciate the practicality of it. Like sometimes my wife, for my birthday, she'll buy me all practical stuff, you know, things that I would use. Because she knows that's, you know, she's like, I don't need a new this or that, you know, just to look flashy or something, you know. But this thing, you know, that holds this up like this, and I'm always trying to hold it up, and she sees me trying to hold, then she gets to stand. Like, wow, that was the best present. It holds my phone upright, you know. So I can talk on Skype with my phone, and it's upright. I don't have to stand because my phone cover doesn't hold it up, and it always falls down. You know. So that's the male, right? But if you bought that for your wife as a present, she could like, what's that? And she goes, well, I always see you trying to lift your phone up. And she's like, okay, but that's not a present. You just buy that any day of the week. You see, the psychology is different. There's a video about this online, and a man bought a vacuum cleaner for his wife for their anniversary. And when she saw it, she threw him in the doghouse. So he goes in this doghouse, and there's all these men. It's like a prison for bad husbands. And you arrive in the doghouse, it's like, what did you do? It was, I bought my wife a vacuum cleaner for the anniversary, and the guys are like, oh, oh man, how could you do that? And then they go to court, you know, testify. Well, you know, the rug was dirty, and this and that. And the judges are all women. They're like, no. So this is explaining female psychology. And there's another one. It's called the manslater. And the woman says something, and it translates into what it means. So the man says, can I go and play golf? She goes, yeah, sure, go ahead. And the translator says, don't go. Yeah. So it goes through like 5-6 scenes like this of you know.
That is so true.
You know, honey, is it okay if I do this? Sure, you know. Don't do it. You know. So to the degree you don't understand these things, you'll just continually make mistakes. So, you know, like how can you be good husband or wife if you don't understand what the other person needs and wants? So you may not give it to them because you think, I don't need it. So, or you may give them things that you need that don't reflect the mentality of a woman. You know, woman, you give her a sari, jewelry, you know, you get new curtains or something like that. Oh, wow. You know, it's like sensual, visual, aesthetic. They're like, but you know, she buys you a MacBook Pro, you're like, oh my God, you know, that's better than earrings, right? Yeah, way better. Yeah. So, yeah. And you go out of your way to do something. So I think that's important. But I think you can apply that principle amongst the same sex also. You know, what is, if I want to have a relationship with someone, what do they like? You know, what would, and guru disciple. You know, what do they need? What will make them happy? What do they want? What are they teaching me? What do they expect from me? Like that. So, we have some questions here. Is it more difficult for a man to be humble to a woman, or vice versa. Yeah, way more difficult. It may take you like 108 lifetimes. But one of the things that can help you be humble with a woman is the famous saying, you can never win an argument with a woman. So just don't try arguing because you'll always lose. So that's just smart. But it seems that men aren't smart enough to understand that. So they keep arguing and they keep losing. But maybe someday they'll understand. Maybe we can write a book. The title will be called Don't Argue with a Woman. Page 1, you always lose. Page 2, finished. There's nothing else to say. You can write, why do you want to write 100? Yeah, and then the next chapter is, that's all you need to know, but it's going to take 300 pages to convince you of this. So, read the book until you realize that you're stupid if you argue with a woman. Right? Yeah. So, and it is easier for a woman to be humble with a man. That's because their nature is like that. They were kind of created to be naturally to subordinate themselves. Now our society is not natural, so you might say, "Oh, I don't think it's natural for women to be subordinate." If you're a woman, you may not feel that way, and that's because of social conditioning. But in a natural environment, you naturally would feel that way. But at the same time, I would say it's not. I don't think it's difficult for all men to do it. I think it's more difficult in general for men than women, but not for all men. And I don't think it's easy for all women to be humble. Some women, they have a harder time than some men have being humble to their husbands. But in general, yeah. Yes. Okay. What else? Can you explain in general and in marriage? Okay, yeah, I guess I already explained. All right. You had a question? No.
Yes.
Yeah,
So you're basically saying that. Okay, so this is just my understanding of what you're saying. Okay.
oh my God, we're supposed to end and go to our next class. I'm sorry, we have another class about love. Okay, so we're going to end this class. We went overtime. Well, actually, we only went 2 minutes over, but we started late. So, okay. Maybe it'll come up in the next class. So we're going to end this class. I'm going to sign off and save this class, and then we'll go to the next one. So just give a few minutes, okay? Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Battery's going to die in the next class. That means we have to plug it in.
Yes.
I have an adapter upstairs.
Where is it?
There's a brown bag in my suitcase. It's about this big.
Yes.
Hari Bol, everyone. We'll see you in a minute.